Hello, I'm Rob Wallace. I'm a visiting scholar at the Institute for Global Studies at the University of Minnesota. I gave the following talk at the University of Washington's Simpson Center for the Humanities in January 2014. Whipsaw of Damocles, are climate change and pandemic influenza related? The talk was sponsored by the Biological Futures in a Globalized World initiative and the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. I was asked to speak on climate change and influenza, a connection on which I originally was largely dubious, save for the generality that climate change will affect everything. But as these things go, upon investigation I learned of a few connections I'll share again today in what we might term a rebroadcast of my Seattle talk. Climate change and deadly influenza are two prospective catastrophes that have captured our cultural and scientific imaginations. The lives and livelihoods of billions of people are potentially at stake. But are climate change and pandemic influenza otherwise related? Are they mechanistically connected in any way? And if so, would such a relationship tell us something new about the nature of these crises? Let's talk climate change first. Carbon dioxide is being pumped into the atmosphere, with some countries of the world producing more than others. I should point out in passing that as Seattle's own Luke Bergman has pointed out, carbon can be produced in the service of capital originating elsewhere. That is, maps such as these showing carbon output in absolute space are misleading, omitting relational production across circuits of capital. That's a fundamental point. Be that as it may, industrial and agricultural production is increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere, shown here in parts per million, as well as other greenhouse gases such as methane and nitrous oxide, way beyond the historical background. The heat trapped by the greenhouse effect has caused global and local spikes in average surface temperature, shown here for 1901 to 2012. Sherwood et al. Just showed the temperature spikes to come are likely to be worse than previously projected. A sensitivity analysis shows that convective mixing between the lower and middle tropical troposphere is expected to dehydrate the low cloud layer. A doubling of carbon dioxide is thereby likely to increase average surface temperature by at least 3 degrees, twice the previous projection. In historical terms, increasing temperatures have caused a catastrophic drop in Arctic ice, which has been tracked locally here in Greenland, and is starting to core out the Arctic shelf. The water has to go somewhere, and with the expansion of water as it warms, is both changing the geography of Earth's land masses and setting off storms of increasing magnitude. The decreasing pH of the oceans are ending biomes as we know them. And alongside overfishing are harking the return of ecologies of long ago. In this case, we see swarms of jellyfish. While we are losing snow cover, the decreasing difference in temperatures north and south are weakening jet streams, allowing, as we saw last week, the polar vortex to escape. In concert, open water in the Arctic permits heat to flow into the atmosphere, driving the cold south. Hurricanes that once alighted out into the Atlantic are being redirected inland by atmospheric stops over the Arctic. So bad news, perhaps old news for some of you, but worth the review with the IPCC's new report. And climate change is, after all, whether we like it or not, part of our collective identity and our historical condition. What then of its relationship with influenza? Climate change will affect everything, so any connection may seem at best what the statisticians label as a secular trend. But there may be more mechanistic connections as well. Several years ago, virologist Robert Webster reported H5N1 samples were becoming increasingly viable at warm temperatures, at which until then they were expected to degrade. If the result still holds, the implications are fundamental to the virus's persistence in equatorial estuaries, in which recombinants appeared to emerge across migratory bird species. There may be effects at broader levels of organization. By a phylogeography of genetic sequences for multiple human influenzas, Derek Smith's group concluded that seasonal influenzas typically circulate about Southeast Asia during the off-season, before a characteristic strain emerges at the start of the flu season to spread across the rest of the world. Towers et al. Conclude that as global temperatures increase, such seasonal influenzas are arriving earlier in the flu season and in a nastier way. Although the relationships in the graphs shown here appear somewhat tenuous, their analysis shows warm winters tend to be followed by severe epidemics with early onset for both influenza A and B. The team hypothesizes that few people are infected with influenza during warm winters, leaving a large fraction of susceptible individuals in the population going into the next season. The two crises share other mechanisms. Agricultural deforestation here in the Amazon both adds atmospheric carbon and reduces carbon sinks, while increasing pasture land and feed for the livestock that serve as a source of new epizootics, including in areas, here Thailand, serving as sources for new flu recombinants. The exploding populations of livestock, overwhelming wildlife in biomass, are meanwhile acting as a major source of methane, a greenhouse gas. Much of the feed on which these animals depend is raised using fertilizers and pesticides distilled from the petroleum and natural gas driving climate change. The crises share ecologies. Climate change is shifting animal and plant distributions. Migratory birds, for instance, are wintering further north as temperatures rise. As are diseases such as dengue, previously associated with the tropics. Such shifts are acting in concert with the destruction of natural habitats, including wetlands, to drive behaviorally adaptive migratory birds to somewhere where the food now is. That is, the expanses of farmland that we saw on the Thailand map, now stretching across whole countries. The new migratory patterns rejigger ecosystems in such a way that increases the interface between wild waterfowl, the ultimate source of multiple influenzas, and poultry, where avian influenzas epidemiologically incubate. Birds and pathogens aren't the only populations on the move. Climate change, like war and natural disasters, produces its own human migration, including of refugees who are typically more susceptible to infectious disease, including, perhaps, influenza. But when it comes to the evolution of new influenzas, the vertically integrated filiere by which all the nodes of poultry production are placed under one company's roof appears at the heart of the matter. Thousands of birds, a veritable genetic monoculture, are crammed into barns as so much food for flu. Indeed, 90% of broiler chickens and turkeys are now produced in houses in which 15,000 and 50,000 birds are confined over their lifespan. The new poultry model, which originated here in the States post-World War II, has since spread geographically. In the 1970s, the model was exported to Asia, and companies such as Chaorom Pakfan set up vertical filières in Thailand and, soon after, elsewhere in Asia. We see particularly an explosion in the number of chickens produced in China from the 1980s on. An explosion increasingly reproduced now worldwide. The hog sector has undergone a similar, if later, upheaval. The number of hog operations steadily declined in the U.S. after 1965, but a real upswing in the heads per farm began only at the start of the 1990s. At the global level, we see the world taking to the new model and increasingly encircled by cities of pigs. The changes in production go hand in hand with jolts in the geographic extent to which poultry and hogs are traded. We see here FileStat data on global live chicken and pig exports by head from 1961 to 2011. The time series appeared to track geographically lengthening production-demand discrepancies, areas of high production meaning demands elsewhere. Globalization exploded in chickens by 1990, not long preceding bird flu H5N1, and after a starting wobble in the 1990s, led by the United States and NAFTA, in pigs by 2000. The profound shifts in stock breeding over the past 3 decades appear to have selected for new swine and avian influenzas, which now serve as a growing reservoir of potentially pandemic strains. Here we have a list of only those highly pathogenic H5 and H7 that struck when no such strain was previously present. Those studies highlighted in blue document on-site shifts from low to high pathogenicity. Indeed, all these save one occurred on large-scale operations of more than 10,000 poultry. In one of many studies, Graham's group found significantly greater odds for H5N1 outbreaks in Thailand in large-scale commercial poultry operations than in backyard flocks. The pattern is repeated across influenza serotypes. A series of sero-epidemiological studies of workers show multiple influenza types widespread across China's poultry filiere. Wang's group, for instance, showed H9 widespread across the commodity chain, especially among poultry market retailers and wholesalers and workers in large-scale poultry breeding operations. Phylogenetic evidence is starting to roll in as well. For instance, in the skyline plot to the top left there, Guan Yi's group shows that H5N1 underwent a population increase and attended cladogenetic burst, a burst in diversity, only when the virus entered populations of domestic ducks and geese in China. At the genome level on the right, the series of reassortment events leading to virulence in which the virus switches genomic segments occurred only when H5N1 entered domestic populations. More recently, a consortium tracked the various H1 and H3 subtypes moving through Hong Kong swine, including classical swine, European or Eurasian avian-like swine, the triple reassortment swine influenza, H1N1 2009, and seasonal H1N1 and H3N2. Eddie Holmes' phylogeography group, meanwhile, used influenza genetics to estimate the number of disease migration events that occurred between different parts of the United States, finding multiple events from South Central and Southeast parts of the United States into the Midwest, the pathways with the greatest swine flows. 3 of swine flu H1N1's genomic segments originated in the classical swine influenza, 3 segments from a North American H3N2 avian swine recombinant, and 2 from a Eurasian swine recombinant. In short, every one of H1N1's genetic segments proved most closely related to those of influenza circulating among swine, together originating on wholly different continents. That's geographic extent and commodity chain no smallholder farmer can cover. Only internationally connected companies can pull that off. Now, in some sense, I've been equivocating. We can, after all, name names. Richard Heed just released a study identifying the 90 corporations and state companies responsible for 63% of the historical contributions to atmospheric carbon and methane. At the top of the list is Chevron, followed by ExxonMobil, Saudi Aramco, BP, and Russia's Gazprom. We see on the left in red the proportion of the total in carbon and methane for which these 90 are responsible. While we can't directly name specific strains of influenza after agribusinesses, as of yet anyway, we can identify the companies at the heart of the change in meat production. In the U.S., livestock, 5 companies, Cargill, Smithfield, Tyson, JBS Swift, and Pilgrim's Pride, parlayed vertical integration and reversals in antitrust law into mass consolidation. They drove their smaller competitors under or took over their operations. According to the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, the 5 companies now control 83% of beef production, 66% of pork production, and 58% of poultry production, some of the greatest monopolistic livestock concentrations in the world. As a result, the U.S. has lost nearly 600,000 independent hog farms and 500,000 cattle ranches since 1980. Meanwhile, as a result of a wave of consolidation, nearly 3/4 of the world's egg production are in the hands of a few multinationals. The primary breeders who engineer the first 3 generations of broiler lines commercial multipliers market declined from 11 companies in 1989 to 4 in 2006. The 10 companies producing layer lines in 1989 were consolidated to 2 by 2006. The Eric Johan Group and Hendrick Genetics. The value of the products these primary breeders provide is biologically locked by offering multiplier companies only the males of the male lines and females of the female line. As a result, batches of hybrid chickens, trade secrets, must be continuously purchased. By this industrial cascade, a single source male chicken can generate millions of broiler progeny, largely bred for monomorphic characteristics alone. The practice in effect removes natural selection as a self-correcting and free ecological service. Any culling upon an outbreak of disease or by farmers in reaction to an outbreak has no bearing on the development of immune resistance to the pathogens identified, as these birds, broilers and layers alike, are unable to evolve in response. In other words, the failure to accumulate natural resistance to circulating pathogens is built into the industrial model before a single outbreak occurs. Naming names is important, for sure, as are the dysfunctions specific to each agricultural sector. But there are deeper contradictions. In a 2010 TED Talk, Jason Clay, Senior Vice President for Market Transformation at World Wildlife Foundation, argued conservationists need to cater to the 500 largest companies who control 70% of the 15 of the world's most ecologically significant commodities. As if corporate control is the natural order of things and didn't help bring about environmental crises in the first place. Nevertheless, Clay argues agribusiness is in the best position to improve on the kinds of production efficiencies needed to reduce resource depletion, the key article of faith underlying green capitalism. The contention is at best ahistorical, omitting the wholesale destruction that produced these monocultures. Efficiencies found in producing commodities are often traded in for deficiencies elsewhere, including such cloying overhead as human rights, health, wages, and to use a reductionist term, ecosystem services. But even as a logical premise, production efficiencies as deployed by, quote, sustainable capitalism, end quote, have long been contradicted by what's called the Jevons paradox. In researching coal, William Stanley Jevons observed an increasing efficiency in extracting a resource in the long term led to an increased use in the resource. Runaway fossil fuel consumption proves Levin's case well enough. This graphic shows that as more appliances became increasingly energy efficient, more gadgets were purchased and bigger TVs are using more energy, however efficiently, thereby increasing overall consumption. But the idea has been supported spectacularly with respect to food. The Green Revolution doubled food production per hectare, but in its after effects also drove widespread malnutrition. In an economic system dedicated to 3% compound growth, better and cheaper extraction, increasing efficiency per unit currency invested, actually selects for greater exploitation, often until a resource is exhausted. Under the present economic model, the paradox is solved only by exploiting an alternate resource once the original is depleted, wiping out the natural base species by species, mineral by mineral, and region by region. The destruction, shown for forests at the global scale on this new map by Hansen et al., develops its own perverse momentum. Under Lauderdale's paradox, as resources are destroyed, what's left becomes more valuable. A decaying resource base, then, is no due cause for agribusiness turning into good global citizens, as Jason Clay argued. On the contrary, agribusiness seeks securing exclusive access to our now financially appreciating, if ecologically declining, landscapes. Such diseconomies of scale are found across agribusiness in all sorts of ways. From my end of the pool, pathogens inherent to such food systems are now spreading farther and faster than ever along lengthening commodity networks, including this 2010 salmonella outbreak in eggs across 22 states, sickening 1,500 Americans and leading to a recall of 550 million eggs. How do such companies survive such catastrophes? The short-term gains in agribusiness production and supply efficiencies have been developed only by way of series of perverse subsidies from and costs to local peoples and the environment, costs kept off company balance sheets. Occupational hazards, pollution, food poisoning, antibiotic resistance, price spikes, climate change, monopolistic consolidation, declining nutritional content, flooding, farmland bubbles, grain dumping, farm dispossession, forced migration, research gaps, and damage to transportation and health infrastructure are routinely externalized to governments, the indigenous, workers, consumers, taxpayers, livestock, and wildlife. Should these costs ever be internalized, meaning put back on company balance sheets, agribusiness would end as we know it. So multinational agribusinesses become and remain as large as they are by virtue of translating capital accumulation into political power, introducing moral hazards of apocalyptic proportions. Companies can also quite literally escape such external costs, engaging in what geographer David Harvey here called spatial fixes, and moving out of areas in which surplus capital becomes locked up or resources have dried up. As we can see in these deforestation maps, they can even geographically surf their own wave of destruction, moving their saws from one plot to the next. Spatial fixes aren't just a materialist ratchet, but have long offered a conceptual cover. From James DeBoe's K Street Ready African Labor Supply Associates, and I'll leave you to think about what that meant, to William Walker's Cornelius Vanderbilt-backed Phalanges, and Bill Gates' Monsanto-linked Alliance for a Green Revolution Africa. Adventurers aim at externalizing internal contradictions dragging on their social reproduction. All for the greater good, of course. Agribusiness penetrating markets abroad repeatedly evoke the declensionist fallacy that its systems will reverse alleged shortfalls in production their efforts helped impose in the first place. However, in the face of such defamation, the alternatives are looking increasingly a better option. Several University of Michigan studies show intensive organics producing as much per acre as petrochemical agriculture. And these alternatives, here mixed use, come with ecological and social benefits agribusiness eschews as a matter of principle. Contour cropping can reduce soil erosion and increase water infiltration, promoting water quality. Integrated pest management by trap crops, pheromone traps, biological control, and deep plowing can reduce and even end the use of pesticides pests often evolve resistance to as a matter of course. Some alternatives go deeper, however. These alternatives are better integrated into their surrounding matrices. This coffee crop is being grown under a shade canopy in which birds, bats, and monkeys live, and that may do more than warm the cockles of the heart. According to an extraordinary line of research by University of Michigan's Yvette Perfecto, John Vandermeer, and their colleagues, such ecosystems naturally control pest insects and plant diseases that can devastate a coffea crop. At their Chiapas field site, pest control emerges from more than the plant's biochemistry embedded in disease resistance. The thatch of ecological relationships, predation, mutualism, competition, etc., up and down the food web in which the plant finds itself can box out pest damage, including species of berry borer, green coffee scale, leaf miners, and coffee rust. The swarming Azteca instabilis ant, there on the right, serves as the keystone species for the control network here, to which later work added contributions made by guilds of bird and bat insectivores. How exactly such services, soil enrichment, water conservation, pest control, how these services emerge from place to place, and how farmers might harness them, for lack of a better term, will require much more of the kinds of research the Perfecto and Vandermeer team has pursued. This, and less so genetic engineering, is the future of cutting-edge 21st century research in agriculture. Think on what modern agriculture does in contrast. It strips out the forest and destroys the kind of self-integrated services nature often embodies. Intensive agriculture acts as one big exclosure, keeping larger fauna out while soil degrades and bugs continue to munch on. Farmers are left to reproduce these services by firebombing their crops and soils with destructive petrochemicals. Along with the model's unsustainability, which serves as a tautological rationale for cutting deeper into the forest that remains, intensive conventional agriculture assigns farmers the absurdist task of nailing every minuscule pest that comes along. What a waste of time and effort, especially as pests evolve resistance to pesticides, as a matter of course. Instead, farmers could have a whole ecosystem moving that bit of bother off their margins. Alienation comes in other forms. A new era of land grabbing is at hand, with the world's powers angling for favorable land purchases for their multinationals. Here we see the 90 deals by which U.S. registered multinationals presently scored hundreds of thousands of hectares for export crops, biofuels, and mining. Landmatrix.org shows similarly globalized distributions for the UK, France, China, and other powers. Africa, home to 60% of the world's remaining virgin farmland, is a particularly active theater. The land grabs involve bringing a petrochemical agriculture organized around feeding livestock and, ironically, producing biofuel, here in the red, to the global south, which until recently was growing food to feed people instead, there in green. The Oakland Institute recently reported agribusinesses are collaborating on African projects with a number of American universities, including Harvard, Vanderbilt, and Spelman. The universities are investing their endowments through European hedge funds to buy or lease vast swaths of African farmland. The school's private partners are to subsequently develop. The Institute estimates $500 million US from all sources invested in African farmland, with expectations of 25% returns from production and land price appreciation on leases running tax-free for as long as 99 years. Now, I'm not sure if the University of Washington is involved in any such deal, but that's something that the students here could investigate on their own. And even if the university is not engaged in such land deals, getting the university to sign a pledge not to do so would be a worthy enterprise. One such land grab in Tanzania, just to give an example, is spearheaded by Agrisol Energy, Iowa-based agribusiness summit group, and the Global Agricultural Fund of the Pharos Financial Group, in partnership with Iowa State University's College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. The three tracks to be developed in Tanzania, with tax holidays and repatriation of dollars out of the country, will host agricultural developments in large-scale genetically modified crops, biofuels, and beef and poultry production, contingent on shuttling out thousands of resident smallholders in favor of labor crews led by expatriate managers. In other words, as with many such land deals, capital accrues at the expense of the subsistence farmers who worked this land for hundreds of years. But there's a catch. The future isn't cut in stone. Indeed, alternate futures are being built out from underneath the agribusiness model, and that in part explains the ferocity with which the companies are pursuing its greenwashing. For instance, with the support of the Mexican government, Zapotec Indians developed a certified sustainable, community-controlled forestry. Plain pine is sold to the state government, and finished goods, including furniture, are produced in an on-site factory. The Huaca cooperative, still a work in progress, plows a third of its profits back into the business, a third into forest preservation, and the rest into its workers and the local community, including pensions, a credit union, and housing for its children studying at university. Another example, the Federation of Unions of Farmers Groups of Niger, with over 62,000 members, more than 60% women, offers its members training, grain banking, input shops, credit lines, savings services, consultation, advocacy, and community radio. Previously, on the dismantling of state cooperatives, farmers there could only consume their harvests or sell them to traders to whom they accumulated massive debt. The poorest cut trees for sale or housing, causing a silted Niger River to flood, worsening already bad conditions. The grain banks cut out usurious traders and improved food coverage during lean seasons. The farm cooperative shops, meanwhile, permit farmers informed access to quality farm inputs and rental machinery. The Federation's credit cooperatives allow farmers to turn excess grain into cheap liquidity for non-farm economic activity. A third example, Tarom Bharat Sangh, a local voluntary organization in Jaipur, India, initiated a watershed restoration program that grew to 1,000 villages. The organization rebuilt johads, traditional mud barriers for collecting water that recharge groundwater, improve forest growth, and conserve water for irrigation and livestock, wildlife, and domestic use. The efforts, coordinated by village councils, restore the Avari River, dry since the 1940s, as well as native bird populations. So if a community's source of wealth is found in its landscape, rather than solely in wages from an externally sourced capital or small plot seasonal output, taking care of the land and local wildlife turns into a prime directive, even, or especially, in a global marketplace. Wealth in a commons a population shares, including its animal population health and the state of climatic conditions, turns back into the kind of value neoclassical economics has long abandoned. Lauderdale's paradox, by which the market rewards efforts to destroy Earth's remaining resources, is resolved in favor of populations that conserve the environments they consume. Sustainability arises in part from communal ownership of the problem of resolving the metabolic rift between ecology and economy, including recycling physical and social resources for the next season, the next year, the next generation. Such communities are almost by definition unlikely, even unable, to engage in the kind of spatial fixes routinely undertaken by agribusiness. The take-home here is that given that some of the world's most difficult dilemmas share homologous causes, stitched deep into the fabric of civilization, parlaying problems off each other, in this case climate change and influenza, isn't utopian, but a practical means by which to avoid the worst of outcomes. And millions of farmers across the globe are already actualizing such alternate futures. And that is a source of great hope. Thank you.